Between 1935 and 1945, the Japanese military ran a biological warfare research program in occupied China that makes Nazi concentration camps look restrained by comparison. They dissected living people without anesthesia to see how long organs could function. They infected prisoners with plague, anthrax, and cholera to test biological weapons. They froze limbs to study frostbite, then thawed them to see what happened to tissue. They performed vivisections on pregnant women. They tested flamethrowers on living subjects tied to stakes. The program was called Unit 731, and when World War II ended, not a single person involved was prosecuted for war crimes. Instead, the United States granted them immunity in exchange for their research data. The files were classified. The doctors went on to prestigious careers in medicine and pharmaceuticals. And for decades, both Japan and the United States covered up what happened. This is the story they buried. Here's what the declassified documents finally reveal. Unit 731 was officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. That was the cover story. The real mission was developing biological weapons for the Japanese military and testing them on live human subjects. The program was established in 1935 under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist who convinced the Japanese military that biological warfare could give them a strategic advantage in their expansion across Asia. The main facility was built in Pingfang, a suburb of Harbin in Manchuria, which Japan had occupied. The complex covered 6 square kilometers. It included laboratories, an airfield, barracks, administrative buildings, and a prison designed to hold test subjects. The Japanese called these prisoners logs, or marutas in Japanese. Not people, logs, because that's easier when you're planning to dissect them alive. The majority of victims were Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, but Unit 731 also experimented on Russians, Koreans, Mongolians, and occasionally Allied prisoners of war, men, women, children, pregnant women, infants. Anyone the Japanese military could capture or kidnap was potential research material. Estimates of the death toll range from 3,000 to over 200,000, depending on whether you count just the Pingfang facility or the network of satellite facilities Unit 731 operated throughout occupied territory. Here's what they did to these people. And this isn't speculation or propaganda. This comes from declassified U.S. military documents, Japanese records, testimony from former Unit 731 members, and physical evidence discovered at the site. Vivisection was standard practice. Researchers would infect prisoners with diseases like plague, cholera, anthrax, or typhoid, then perform surgery without anesthesia to observe the effects on internal organs while the victim was still alive. They wanted to see disease progression in real time. Anesthesia would affect the results, so they strapped people down conscious and cut them open. Former Unit 731 member Yoshio Shinozuka testified that he performed vivisections on prisoners who were completely aware during the procedure. They tested biological weapons by releasing plague-infected fleas on villages. They contaminated water supplies with cholera and typhoid to measure infection rates. They gave prisoners injections disguised as vaccinations that were actually disease cultures, then monitored how long it took them to die. They tested the effectiveness of different pathogens by varying doses, delivery methods, and environmental conditions. Frostbite experiments were conducted to help Japanese troops fighting in cold climates. Prisoners would have limbs exposed to freezing temperatures until the tissue died, sometimes by being forced to stand outside in winter, sometimes by having limbs submerged in ice water. Then researchers would experiment with different thawing methods. Sometimes they'd use warm water, sometimes direct heat. Sometimes they'd just smash the frozen limbs with sticks to see what happened to the tissue. Survivors of these experiments, if they lived, would have their damaged limbs amputated without anesthesia for further study. Pressure chamber experiments tested what happened to the human body at different atmospheric pressures. Prisoners were placed in sealed chambers where air pressure was increased or decreased until organs ruptured, eyes popped out of sockets, or death occurred. Researchers documented exactly how much pressure the human body could withstand. Weapons testing used live prisoners as targets. They tested grenades at different distances. They tested chemical weapons to determine lethal doses. They tested flamethrowers by tying prisoners to stakes and burning them alive while measuring time to death and tissue damage. They even tested conventional bullets and bayonets by shooting prisoners or practicing surgical techniques on living subjects. Pregnant women were deliberately infected with syphilis to study how the disease transferred to fetuses. Then they would perform vivisections on both mother and child to observe the infection. Infants born in the facility were used for experiments, testing how quickly babies succumbed to disease, or how infant anatomy differed from adults when dissected. Blood experiments tested how much blood loss a person could survive. Prisoners would have blood drained slowly, while researchers monitored vital signs. Sometimes, they'd replace blood with horse blood or seawater to see if it could function as a substitute. It couldn't, but they documented exactly how long it took for organ failure to occur. The scale of this operation was massive. Unit 731 had a staff of over 3,000 researchers, technicians, and military personnel. They had dedicated teams for different research areas: bacterial weapons, chemical weapons, biological warfare field testing, and human experimentation. They had breeding facilities for plague-infected fleas and rats. They had production facilities capable of manufacturing tons of biological weapons agents, and they used these weapons. In 1940, Unit 731 dropped plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities including Ningbo and Changde. Plague outbreaks followed, killing thousands of civilians. They contaminated water sources with cholera and typhoid. They distributed disease-contaminated food to Chinese villages. Conservative estimates suggest Unit 731's biological warfare operations killed over 400,000 Chinese civilians during the war. When World War II ended in August 1945, Unit 731 received orders to destroy all evidence. They executed the remaining prisoners, demolished buildings, and blew up the facilities. Staff members fled back to Japan with orders to never speak about what they'd done. Many dumped research materials and equipment in rivers. Some buried evidence in remote locations. The goal was to eliminate any trace of Unit 731's activities before Soviet or American forces arrived. But the Soviets got there first. They captured some Unit 731 personnel and conducted the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in 1949. 12 Unit 731 members were convicted and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 2 to 25 years. The trials revealed extensive details about Unit 731's operations. The international community largely ignored them. The United States took a different approach. American occupation forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, began secretly negotiating with Unit 731 leadership. The U.S. wanted the biological warfare research data. Everything Unit 731 had learned from years of human experimentation, all the data on pathogen effectiveness, weapons development, and biological warfare tactics. This was information American researchers couldn't legally obtain. So they made a deal. Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii and other Unit 731 leadership were granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for their research data and testimony. The deal was classified. None of the Unit 731 staff would be tried at the Tokyo war crimes trials. In exchange, they would hand over all research findings and cooperate with American biological warfare programs. Documents declassified in the 1990s confirm this arrangement was approved at the highest levels of the U.S. military and government. The reasoning was strategic. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union was also interested in Unit 731's research. American officials argued that granting immunity to these war criminals was justified by the military value of their data and by preventing the Soviets from obtaining it. They got their data, and the perpetrators walked free. Shiro Ishii lived quietly in Tokyo until his death in 1959. He was never charged with any crime. Other Unit 731 leadership went on to prominent careers. Some became university professors. Some took positions in pharmaceutical companies. Some worked for Japan's National Institute of Health. The Japanese government maintained There was no evidence of human experimentation, and that Unit 731 was simply an epidemic prevention unit, exactly as the cover story claimed. This denial continued for decades. Japan's government refused to acknowledge Unit 731's crimes. Textbooks didn't mention it. Official histories ignored it. When survivors and victims' families demanded acknowledgement, they were dismissed. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that former Unit 731 members began breaking their silence, and Japanese journalists started uncovering the truth. In 2002, the Tokyo District Court ruled that Unit 731's biological warfare attacks and human experiments were proven historical facts, but the court also ruled that China had waived all claims to reparations in a 1972 treaty, so no compensation would be paid to victims. Japan's government has still never officially apologized for Unit 731, though some individual politicians have acknowledged it occurred. Here's what makes this particularly disturbing beyond the obvious horror of the experiments themselves. The United States knowingly granted immunity to people who had committed some of the worst war crimes in human history. They did it to obtain research data, and then they classified everything to avoid public outrage. The data Unit 731 provided was used in American biological warfare programs. Some of the information went to Fort Detrick, the U.S. Army's biological warfare headquarters. American researchers incorporated Unit 731's findings into their own work. So the torture and murder of thousands of people directly contributed to U.S. military research, and the people responsible were protected from justice to make that possible. There's no evidence the data was even particularly valuable. Much of it was poorly documented or scientifically questionable, because it came from experiments with no ethical oversight and questionable methodology. Some American scientists who reviewed it later said the research quality was substandard. But at the time, U.S. officials believed it was valuable enough to justify letting war criminals escape prosecution. The cover-up worked for decades. Most Americans don't know Unit 731 existed. It's not taught in schools. Most Japanese citizens didn't learn about it until recently. The victims received no justice, no compensation, and for many years, no acknowledgement that their suffering even occurred. The perpetrators lived comfortable lives, some dying of old age without ever facing consequences. Documents remain classified to this day. The full extent of U.S. knowledge about Unit 731 and the details of the immunity deal are still partially secret. Japan continues to resist full disclosure. We may never know the complete truth about what happened, how many people died, or exactly how much the United States knew and when. What we do know is damning enough. A military research program systematically tortured and murdered thousands of people in medical experiments. When the war ended, instead of holding anyone accountable, the United States granted immunity to preserve strategic advantage. Both governments then covered it up for decades to avoid embarrassment and potential war crimes liability. Unit 731 wasn't just a Japanese war crime. It became an American cover-up. And that cover-up reveals something important about how governments operate when secrecy serves their interests. They'll classify evidence of atrocities. They'll grant immunity to war criminals if it's strategically useful. They'll deny documented facts for decades if acknowledging them would be politically inconvenient. The next time someone tells you that governments don't cover up massive crimes, that classified documents are just routine security measures, remember Unit 731. Remember that the Japanese government denied it happened for 50 years, despite physical evidence and survivor testimony. Remember that the United States granted immunity to people who dissected living prisoners, then classified the deal and the data for half a century. The conspiracy isn't that Unit 731 happened. That's documented history. The conspiracy is what happened after. Who was protected, what was hidden, and why it took decades for the truth to come out. That's the part they didn't want you to know.